If there's one thing Russian President Vladimir Putin likes, it's a good hostage. Informed by his days in the KGB and now forming an instrumental part of his grand plan to seize the sovereign nation of Ukraine, Putin and his top brass in the Kremlin have been on a hostage-taking bender in the last couple of years. Unprotected Ukrainian towns and villages packed with civilians are held hostage by Russian missiles to try and coerce Ukraine into standing down. Europe was held hostage by Russian oil ahead of the winter of 2022 in an unsuccessful attempt to get Europe to back off their support for Ukraine. And the Ukrainian regions of Crimea and the Donbass have been held hostage for the better part of the last decade in a long, slow play meant to either weaken Ukraine to the point of collapse or force it to stand in opposition to a Russian army that before March of 2022, nobody on the planet believed it could stand against. But Vladimir Putin has one hostage that grants him more leverage, bar none, than any other in his arsenal: the Black Sea Grain Initiative. First negotiated in July 2022 between the UN, Turkey, and Russia, the Grain Initiative was supposed to ensure that Ukraine, one of the world's biggest producers of grain, could send its exports around the world even as war raged against Russia on land. The reasons for the deal were as simple as they were critical. Ukrainian wheat, corn, and sunflower oil are absolutely essential in keeping some of the poorest countries and regions around the world from starving. But ever since the deal was put into effect, Russia has continually threatened its cancellation, until July the 17th, 2023, when Russia forced the deal to expire. With that act, he essentially took the entire undeveloped world hostage, with the implication being that the world can either find a peace in Ukraine that favors Russia, or they can watch millions of people starve. In today's episode of Warographics, we'll be diving into the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the massive implications of Russia's decision to end it, and how, if at all, the world can hope to fight back. Now, in order to understand just how significant the Black Sea Grain Initiative was, we first got to understand how Ukraine's grain exports worked prior to the outbreak of war with Russia in early 2022. Ukraine has long held the informal title of the world's breadbasket, and despite being home to less than 0.5% of the global population and taking up less than 0.5% of its global landmass, Ukraine produces an entire 10% of the world's wheat, plus 15% of corn and 13% of barley. Add to that the fact that Ukraine is responsible for over 50% of the world's sunflower oil production, and the idea of a surplus begins to be something of an understatement. So, with so much product to give away, and a relatively close proximity to many areas of the world that really need food, Ukraine has long been a key exporter of grains across the developing world. Everybody likes grain, of course, but there are a few parts of the world that desperately need grain in order to survive. And for the people living in those places, it's Ukraine that has been one of their most important lifelines. Egypt, Indonesia, and Bangladesh are among Ukraine's largest grain markets, but they also send substantial amounts to Yemen, a country sitting on the precipice of mass starvation. And even though many developing nations in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa receive less grain than those major recipients do, we've also got to remember a couple of key points. Firstly, there's often fewer people in those other nations, meaning obviously a smaller share of the export market. And secondly, the place grain ends up when it leaves Ukraine is often not its final destination. And then thirdly, a relatively small population of Ukrainian grain means a lot more to people living on the edge of famine. Taking it away has a much greater consequence. This was immediately played out in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when a blockade around critical Ukrainian port cities like Mariupol and Odessa made export shipments by sea impossible. Distracted by the existential crisis of a full-scale war, and with Ukrainian rail lines and their westward European partners unequipped to handle the mass flow of grain on short notice, Ukraine's exports were forced to grind to a halt. Wheat, corn, and barley prices skyrocketed around the world, a major inconvenience for richer nations, but a fact that meant poorer ones risked being unable to afford it at all. When war broke out in Ukraine, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East were already on the precipice of severe food insecurity, mostly owing to the significant collateral damage inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The problem here has to do with the fact that food insecurity around the world isn't actually a matter of supply shortages. There is enough grain to feed everyone on the planet today using grain that already exists, and there's enough surplus that even with Ukraine taken out of the equation, the ratio of grain to human mouths is still more than satisfactory to keep everybody fed. The real issue around food security comes down to access and availability. You can have a whole mountain of corn and wheat in, say, Australia, but if there aren't enough ships, trucks, and fuel available to get it to the starving people of Yemen, then it will just sit in Australia and rot. So too is that grain not going to get to Yemen if Australia has been under the impression that it's supposed to be sending that grain to nearby Indonesia. Shifting the world's pre-existing supply lines on short notice is just functionally impossible, and while it might have been nice for the global community to be a bit more proactive once it seemed as if the Russian invasion of Ukraine was inevitable, well, that didn't happen, and we can't change it now. This is why it was so important to negotiate a grain deal between Russia and Ukraine so that grain that was already earmarked for these vulnerable populations could get there. In July of 2022, Turkey was able to broker an agreement between Russia and Ukraine with the help and endorsement of the United Nations that would free up about 25 million tons of grain that were sitting in Ukraine and waiting to transfer by allowing them to pass unmolested through the Black Sea, where Russia and Ukraine share a coastline. Russia would agree to the establishment of secure corridors for travel, refrain from attacking specific ports and grain storage areas, and abide by the directions of a Turkish control center managing the flow of ships in and out of the Black Sea. This deal was also good for Russia, another of the world's largest grain exporters, as well as a major producer of fertilizer. With the deal in place, sanctions against those Russian products were lifted, and they too were kept immune from the devastation of war. By all accounts, the grain deal was a success for as long as it lasted. Agreed upon for stretches of 4 months at a time, it was renewed 3 times, with each successful renegotiation another small indicator that perhaps dialogue over grain exports could blossom into a broader or even war-ending discussion. The deal brought down the price of essential foods worldwide. The UK estimates that 61% of it went to low and middle-income countries, and 725,000 metric tons of Ukrainian grain were sent by the World Food Programme directly to Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Yemen, and other nations that exist on the constant brink of starvation. That's only a small portion of the tens of millions of tons that Ukraine exported under the deal, but like we said before, the critical factor here isn't the net quantity of grain being distributed. A kilo of grain makes a few loaves of bread in France. In Yemen, it keeps a child alive until next week. But the Black Sea Grain Initiative, like so many life-saving measures in this world, wasn't fated to last forever. Russia began dragging its feet on ship inspections, which Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey performed jointly on every ship in order to make sure that they're only carrying grain. And while the UN had the capacity to check as many as 40 ships daily, Russia lowered the overall total from 10 a day in October of 2022 to 2 a day in May of 2023. This badly diminished the amount of grain that Ukraine could move, while Russian ships passed unmolested, reaping the rewards of the side of the deal that benefited Moscow. Russia also seized on export patterns that saw large amounts of Ukrainian grain sent to China, while less than the intended amount reached poorer countries, taking these numbers out of context to claim that the grain was being misused and shipped to high-income countries, when in reality, and we'll say it again, reorganizing the world's global supply lines just isn't that simple. By midsummer 2023, reeling from an unsuccessful winter offensive, desperately scrambling to make preparations for a Ukrainian counter-offensive, and dealing with the aftermath of a coup attempt by the paramilitary organization known as the Wagner Group, Russia appeared to decide that it was time to stop playing nice with Ukraine's exports. Chafing under sanctions and shipping regulations, as well as skepticism from many of Russia's former Western customers, the Russian grain industry did not thrive in the way that Ukraine's did under the deal. Russian exports of ammonia through a Ukrainian port never resumed as scheduled, although this was a direct result of damage to their pipeline in battles with Ukraine. Add to that the fact that Ukraine was still getting paid to sell the goods they exported because, well, of course they did, and we can only imagine that the Black Sea Grain Initiative must have been seen in Moscow as being unnecessarily generous. Despite efforts by the UN to intervene, Vladimir Putin had already made up his mind, and after rejecting last-minute efforts to ease Russia's stated concerns, the deal expired without renewal in mid-July of this year. Now, we've got to point out here that Russia's rationale for ending the deal may have been, well, a little bit manufactured, particularly on account of just how successful the 2022-23 trade year was for Moscow. During that year, Russia exported a full 45.5 million metric tons of wheat, an all-time record, and projections for the following trade year suggest they'll break that record by another 2 million tons. And that's not just grain production, that's grain exports, meaning that Russia has buyers for all of that product. As for the real reasons Russia decided to pull out of the deal, there's only one relatively simple explanation. Taking Ukrainian grain out of the market while causing a global panic raises the price of grain by a lot. And if Russia still has buyers for all of this grain, it's an opportunity to jack up their own prices and get some additional revenue flowing in. They can then send that straight to a war effort that badly needs some extra coin, and such a blatant manipulation of grain prices could be the influx Russia needs to get itself back on track. And we can also take into account the military benefits of locking down the Black Sea. Russia has increasingly targeted the port city of Odessa after the deal expired, a decision perhaps informed partially because Odessa doesn't appear to be under the umbrella of either of Ukraine's Patriot missile systems, but also because of the incredible economic power of the port. Add to that the potential to defend the Isthmus of Crimea by sea in response to an increased threat of encroachment by Ukraine, and it quickly becomes clear why the Russian military may not want to have Ukraine's coastal cities kept off limits. But most important of all is the global leverage that Russia has acquired simply by acting like a prick. It is impossible to know for sure, but we would hazard a guess that the biggest benefit Russia sees in cutting off grain supply to the developing world is that now the United Nations and the global West have to beg Russia to allow shipments to resume. When faced with those sorts of requests, Russia is then able to say things like, well, okay then, recognize my claims in Crimea. Or, okay then, don't send F-16s or advanced tanks to Ukraine. Or, okay then, we're going to need German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to get on camera and say, I'm a little boy. The commonality behind all of those requests are that they're demands that the rest of the world would dismiss out of hand until and unless the lives of millions of hungry people are on the line. Now, at the time of writing this video, it's only been a few weeks since the grain deal expired, and we have not had time to see or assess the ramifications of this decision across the world. But we can take an educated guess. Although the global price of grain may stabilize before too long, countries where grain is already scarce or where stockpiles don't exist are going to see their domestic grain prices go through the roof. In countries where many people don't have the money for that grain, hunger and starvation immediately become an urgent threat. This at a time when global conflicts and rising droughts are already reducing the meager crop yields that developing countries could use to offset the shortage of grain. And like we've been trying to hammer home today, this isn't so simple as just rerouting surplus grain from other parts of the world to go to the places that need it most. Or rather, the solution is that simple, but the process it takes to make that actually happen is incredibly difficult and frustratingly slow. Under Russia's new rule in the Black Sea, any and all ships leaving Ukrainian ports are viewed as legitimate military targets, no matter what they're carrying or whose flag they're flying. Increased military pressure on the city of Odessa, including frequent air attacks, have made it too risky for shipping companies to try and do business in the area. Naturally, Putin has spoken out of both sides of his mouth on the issue, insinuating that there could be a return to the grain deal if his demands are met. But it should be no surprise that the nations of the world are, by now, just a touch skeptical. Now, there's one bright spot in all of this, though it's not unanimous worldwide. The broad consensus by most of the world's nations is that the developing world still must be fed somehow, some way. Russia has begun directly attacking Ukraine grain stores, and according to the UN, the grain that has already been lost could have fed as many as 66 million people for a day, making the prospect of any further escalation potentially devastating in the long term. But in addition to the diplomatic wheeling and dealing that's currently going on between Ukraine, Russia, and the member nations of NATO, there's also another, more ad hoc effort going on in the Black Sea. According to global ship tracking organizations, bulk carriers and other vessels located in the Black Sea have begun to call Russia's bluff, not by making a headlong dash to Odessa right away, but by dropping anchor with their transponders on closer and closer to Ukraine's territorial waters. Their intent appears to be to probe forward and see what sort of response comes, and their early forays just over the line of Ukrainian territory appear not to have earned the sort of hellfire that Vladimir Putin promised. A few days later, on July the 31st, 2023, 3 civilian cargo ships decided to go for it. On that day, one ship registered under Israel, one under Greece, and one under a joint Turkish and Georgian registration joined together and made a mad dash for one of Ukraine's grain ports on the delta of the Danube River. This was situated relatively close to Romania's territorial waters, but far enough and anchored for long enough that they clearly violated Russia's warnings against passage. As it turns out, these ships still sail today, with the subtext being that Russia is either unwilling or unable to interdict the ships or attack them outright. Now, this may have something to do with the several NATO warplanes that flew over the ships as they passed, and the nearby Eurofighter and F-16 fighter jets stationed in Romania. But even still, the journey took place with all 3 cargo ships' transponders on. We can only imagine how nervous those crew members on board must have been, but in the end, they got away scot-free for what Russia has claimed is a grievous transgression. The nearby Russian warship, the corvette dubbed the Sergei Kotov, took no action to intervene. Like anything else in this war, even small signals are signals nonetheless, and while we can't interpret any exact meaning to Putin's apparent decision not to drop a missile on the SS whatever the it would appear that there's at least some room for countries around the world to call Putin's bluff. At the same time, at the time of writing, there are several dozen ships sitting politely near the border of Ukraine's territorial waters, and while we wouldn't call it particularly likely that all those ships are about to form an armada and head to Ukraine's ports, they appear to be waiting for some indication on what they can do next. Publicly, global shipping organizations have expressed to Ukraine that they still are interested in transporting Ukrainian grain if they can operate with a reasonable assumption that they won't take a Kinzhal missile to the bow. Ukraine has promised the UN International Maritime Organization that it would establish its own temporary corridor to facilitate the passage of ships and even provide compensation for any damages, although, of course, Russia has reacted to these claims with all the sort of fire and brimstone we would expect. Given that each of these ships could be worth tens of millions of dollars, with as many as 20 to 25 crew members on board, Ukraine's guarantees alone aren't quite enough to mitigate the risk of being targeted outright, running into mines, or potentially being caught in the middle of a naval battle. Ukraine's help would make things better, but Ukraine by itself is unlikely to fix the issue. So now we've got to acknowledge that even if the rest of the world is able to sneak an occasional ship into the Black Sea, even if Russia will tolerate the occasional movement of grain out of Ukraine, it's not likely that Russia would completely fail to intervene if the world simply carried on grain exports like nothing happened. That means that in order for millions of people around the world not to starve, well, we're going to have to solve world hunger, and we're going to have to do it without the Ukrainian breadbasket, and we're going to have to do it really quickly. Now, the first question to ask in this situation was, well, how else can Ukraine either force a return to the negotiating table or get their grain out some other way? They can try to make up some of the difference by sending grain by rail westward to Europe, but this is a much less efficient process and allows the shipment of far less grain. This also generated backlash from countries like Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, who have expressed that they are already inundated with Ukrainian grain to the detriment of their own domestic agriculture. Nor are Ukraine's military efforts enough. As it stands right now, a long-awaited counter-offensive has all but stalled and is making only minimal headway into Russian fortified areas. Making matters worse, China, a major recipient of Ukrainian grain, appears to be disinterested in pressuring Russia to resume the deal, willing to take the pain of potential shortages rather than do the West's dirty work in negotiations. It's a small element of a much larger initiative to bring Russia into China's growing coalition around the world, and as Xi Jinping apparently sees it, there's more to gain by supporting Putin here than feeding the rest of the world or his own people. One solution may lie on Ukraine's Danube River, where ships could conceivably sail a direct voyage to Romania's own port cities and then leave through there. Ukraine already sends about 2 million metric tons of grain a month through that route, and the Ukrainian Grain Association claims it could double that transfer rate in the next few months. While Russia has jurisdiction within its own territorial waters in the Black Sea and can functionally do whatever it wants in international and Ukrainian waters, can't violate the territorial waters of Romania without royally pissing off a country that happens to be a member of NATO. From there, neighboring Bulgaria is also a NATO member, and so is Turkey, a country that controls passage through the Bosphorus Strait and the wider Mediterranean Sea. By using the Danube and hugging close to the coastline once ships emerge into the Black Sea, Ukrainian grain could conceivably be transferred to and kept under the control of NATO partners, although this is the sort of feat that would take a massive logistical effort to pull off. There's also the potential to use NATO's presence in a different way, to organize convoys in which merchant ships are protected by NATO warships as a clear deterrent to Russia. Convoys could either reflag merchant vessels to indicate that they're under the protection of NATO member nations, or they could just surround the vessels with well-armed ships and dare Russia to try and shoot a missile in a straight line for once. But either way, the general idea is the same. Russia is generally viewed as being highly unlikely to take military action against a NATO target, especially considering how much trouble they're having keeping the smaller nation of Ukraine away from NATO membership, so this solution is among the ones that seem most outwardly likely to succeed. As for how such a convoy would actually work, one clear vision comes from the retired Admiral James Stavridis of the US Navy, who contributed a potential plan to the Washington Post immediately following the dissolution of the grain deal. According to Stavridis, any operation to protect ships in the Black Sea would have to take place independent from the United Nations, since Russia holds veto power on the UN Security Council. Instead, an intervention could come come from either NATO or from a coalition of nations who choose to opt into a convoying operation. Most likely, any Black Sea convoys would rely on the assistance of two key naval assets in the area: a group of minesweepers, which would be instrumental in clearing out the sea mines Russia has laid around Ukrainian ports, and a group of 6 large warships, a combination of frigates and destroyers. As Stavridis lays out, one potential approach would be to bundle these merchant ships into groups of 3 to 5, with a pair of warships armed with guided missiles assigned to each group. In the air, surveillance planes would keep constant watch over the water for any incoming Russian ships, especially from the Black Sea Fleet, while fighter aircraft maintain a state of readiness in order to quickly intercept and deal with any attacks that come by air. Add in some satellite overwatch and a good bit of diplomatic pressure, and Ukraine's grain might be able to get in and out unmolested. Of course, this plan would come with a lot of risk. After all, it would inherently put NATO warships in direct opposition to a lot of Russian heavy weapons, meaning that one trigger-happy fighter pilot or one rogue ship commander could very well start an escalation of force. Then there's Turkey right next door, part of NATO, but still something of a strange bedfellow with Russia. If this plan is to go forward, it will require the world to call Putin's bluff and keep everybody's fingers crossed that nothing spills out of control. And then there's another option, one that Ukraine is already taking: retaliatory attacks on Russian sea targets with the intent of pushing Russian forces in the area into a defensive posture and deterring them from coming close to Ukrainian territorial waters. On August 5th, 2023, Ukrainian naval drones attacked a Russian naval base on the Black Sea, damaging an amphibious landing strip called the Olenogorski Gunyak so badly that, according to Ukraine, it would be unable to fulfill its duties. Ukraine has also attacked bridges around the Isthmus of Crimea, possibly in an attempt to get Russia to circle the wagons around its beloved annexed territory rather than spread themselves too thin. It's possible that either or both of those approaches could force Russia to allow a return to regular grain transfers. But each option also has a cost. In Ukraine, farmers have got to know how much seed to sow at the start of the growing season, and if, hypothetically, they undersow their field, anticipating a lack of resolution, but all of a sudden trade starts up again, there's a real possibility that Ukraine will have only a fraction of its usual exportable grain available. But so too much, and if the world doesn't reach a resolution, then millions of tons of the stuff will rot in Ukraine at a loss equivalent to billions of US dollars. And then there's the question of what to do with the world's shipping vessels. Do you subsidize them and encourage them to hang out on the fringes of the Black Sea, ready to swoop in at a moment's notice, or do you send them elsewhere and do your best to restructure global supply lines however possible? It's a series of trade-offs where every cost gives Russia more leverage than they already had. Whatever the world's eventual solution is, one thing remains abundantly clear. The longer the Black Sea Grain Initiative goes unrenewed, and the longer Ukraine's precious cargo is kept in storage or held up in port, the more people around the world are going to be at risk of food insecurity, malnutrition, or even starvation. In a world where logistical supply is so baked in, so firmly pre-established, that grain around the world will rot and be wasted before a ship can even come and pick it up. There is no immediate alternative for Ukraine's exports. We can only hope that Putin and the Kremlin choose to see reason and do some small semblance of the right thing, but then again, we've been waiting for that sort of moment for years now. All indications are the world will have to learn to keep its most vulnerable people fed without the dictator's help.